So welcome back, everybody. If you please take your seats. And for those of you at home and online, take your seats. You're all very welcome back. I'm hoping this will be a very energetic session as we lead into lunch. I'm not sure what will happen after lunch, so the standard has to be set high. So we've, again for you, three really excellent speakers. I think they're going to speak to actually quite a lot of the questions that came up this morning, but they're each going to delve into a different aspect of environment and health. And in this session on healthy environments and society, I'm going to call on Lena Jacobs to speak to us first. And Lena has worked in the Department of the Taoiseach, primarily in economic policy, for 6 years. She's currently working in the Economic Development and Digital Unit with responsibility for the development and implementation, which we know is the key thing, of Wellbeing Framework for Ireland. So good luck with this. She's worked in a range of policy areas, and before joining the civil service, Lena worked in Eurofund and the Open Society Foundation. So Lena, you're very welcome. And for those of you who are used to using Slido, please submit questions. And we're going to go to Slido first, probably after when we get to the panel discussion at the end. So you're very welcome, Lena, and look forward to hearing from you.
Good morning. It's great to be here today and to actually be in person. I think this is the first time I have presented in a in-person forum for a few years now. So today, as Maurice very said already, I'm going to be talking about the Wellbeing Framework for Ireland. So the Wellbeing Framework for Ireland is a government initiative. It came out of a programme for government commitment, which was to develop a set of wellbeing indices to create a well-rounded, holistic view of how our society is faring and ensure that it is utilised in a systematic way. That's their implementation word of the day. So before I go into the how or the what, I just want to talk a bit about the why. There's a famous quote by Bobby Kennedy, which says, GDP measures everything except that which is worthwhile. So this wellbeing framework is really trying to broaden out that kind of measurements piece. What's important for people's quality of life? How are we doing in equality? How are we doing in sustainability? That kind of beyond economics approach is really the key purpose of the wellbeing framework. Another thing that it does is it looks at outcomes. So it's not talking about inputs, it's talking about outcomes, which should hopefully support working cross-sectorally. This conference today is the exact kind of thing that I'm talking about here, and actually I use this healthy environment space a lot as an example of this, where you find an outcome that's important for multiple different sectors. In this case, a healthy environment is important for the environment sector, it's important for the health sector, and that way you get those, as Laura said, co-benefits. You can share resources, and you can work cross-sectorally towards a one desirable outcome. And then finally, just as a bit more of a kind of wonky piece, it should support a broader evidence base, because you're focusing on different types of data that might not normally be discussed in the kind of normal economic space. It can find where there's data gaps. It can find where there's maybe long lead-in times or not as current data as you would like, and hopefully support data improvements in those spaces. So in terms of the development of the framework, I'm just going to tell you quickly how it was done. So it's been led by the Department of the Taoiseach and with the sponsor departments of Department of Public Expenditure and the Department of Finance. So it's really important that we've had those central economic departments who are kind of leading the development of the framework. We've had a huge amount of progress in just under 2 years. It kind of started early 2021. It's been developed in a phased basis. So the first phase, which kind of ran up until the summer of 2021, involved stakeholder and expert consultation, which was led by the National Economic and Social Council. It included the foundation of an interdepartmental group, which still is meeting today, which involves pretty much every department in the government. And then also a lot of discussions with CSO, along with other key actors, including the EPA, including the Department of Health, and indeed a colleague from ESRI. So everyone here has been involved to identify those indicators. So the outcome of that phase was a published report which set out a vision, a conceptual framework, and a static dashboard. We moved on then to phase 2, which had a second phase of consultation. This was really testing those things that we set out first with the broader public, with stakeholders again, and then also with some kind of key interest groups. The CSO published their interactive dashboard, which is hosted on their website. I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. We published our wellbeing portal, which kind of brings together all of this information and related initiatives. And then a few pieces of research, but two in particular I want to mention, were conducted. The Department of Finance did one on sustainability, which was trying to make sure that sustainability was included and at the heart of this framework. And then secondly, the National Economic and Social Council did some work on, they reviewed 3 kind of best practice countries on how they would have embedded their own initiatives into government. So again, there was a published report in June of this year, which refined the various outputs and kind of set out a few key steps of how we're going to take this forward, which again, I'll talk about in a little bit. So this is kind of my little flow chart about what's involved, what's in the framework. So I'm just going to go through each of them. The first one is the overall vision. The high level of that is enabling all of our people to live fulfilled lives now and into the future. We've got that a bit more in detail, which is a kind of, we call them the goals, but they're probably still a bit of a vision, but enable people to have purposeful lives that support good physical and mental health, enabling the development of skills across the life cycle and providing a good standard of living. Ensure a sustainable sense of place, including an appropriate and safe place to live, and protection of Ireland's environment, climate and biodiversity. And preserve balance, inclusivity and equality of opportunities across society with open and effective government, empowering families, friends and communities to grow, connect and meaningfully engage. So that's the high-level vision, and then we have the conceptual framework, and this is trying to just be as comprehensive as possible of what's important for quality of life, very, very broadly. And so this is what we've come up with in our latest report. I hope everyone can see it. So we have 11 dimensions. It's modeled after the OECD well-being framework, and we've just molded it a little bit for the kind of Irish audience or the Irish context. So there's 11 dimensions. They cover a lot of different things, including, you'll see that it's the white bold at the top, so environment, climate, biodiversity. We have mental and physical health. We have work and job quality, income and wealth, connections, community and participation. And then underneath those, we have just a few kind of things to put a bit more detail on it, and we go into a lot more detail in the report. So for example, on the environment, climate and biodiversity, we have environmental quality, human impact and the experienced environment. It's a mix of subjective and objective, and that's very important for us as well. There's 2 cross-cutting themes, which is sustainability and equality. On the sustainability side, you'll see some of the aspects have a little green leaf next to them. Those are ones that were kind of identified as particularly important for sustainability. That's economic, social, or environmental sustainability. But I think what's really important about this is that this is all very interconnected. It's not actually divided out at all. I spoke already about environment and health, and we've been talking about that a lot, but if you go through each of them, I mean, I kind of did a little experiment myself last night. You can kind of start thinking about how environment and health can cross over with each of these. So, for example, on housing, you can imagine quality of housing is very important, both for health in terms of, different like presence of mold or whatever, if you have poor quality of housing, and then also in terms of the energy usage and the energy leakage if you have poor quality of housing. Similarly, safety and security, the impact on mental health if you don't feel safe, that's quite an obvious one. And then also in our threats to safety, we include things like extreme weather events. So again, that's the increased level of extreme weather events is impacting on your safety, and that's obviously linked to the environment. So just to really drive home that idea of the linkages across this framework. So next, we have our high-level dashboard of indicators. So that is hosted very kindly by the CSO and was developed with the CSO very carefully. It has 35 indicators. It's broken down by specific different cohorts to kind of draw out inequalities. And the really important thing about this is that it draws from a lot of different products, a lot of different statistical products, but it automatically updates, which is really, really great because as new data becomes available, it will automatically update. So I'd really encourage anybody who's interested in this sort of stuff to go have a look at it, and it's very interactive. It's really, really interesting product. So that's the kind of development, but then as we've been saying today, the hard part is that second part, ensure that it is utilised in a systematic way across government, and that's in budgeting, at national and local level. That's what the Programme for Government says. So we're starting on that. As a first step, what we did when we published the second report is we published our first annual analysis of the indicators. So what this does is it looks across a 5-year trend, and it compares our performance with usually the EU average, and it assesses that in terms of the dimensions, the 11 dimensions. It looks at certain cohorts that experience inequality or disadvantage in a high proportion of those indicators, and it also looks at our sustainability indicators, which have been tagged in a similar way as we saw in the framework. So this is kind of the state of play as it stands. It looks actually quite good, which we were all kind of surprised about, but it's generally quite a positive picture. You'll see that the only red is environment, climate and biodiversity. It's quite stark, actually, I thought. In terms of just to mention as well, sorry, before I go on, and to highlight, this is over a long period of time. A lot of the data isn't from this year, it might be from last year, it might be from a few years ago, just because of the way the data comes out. So we're really using this as a picture of the longer term, medium term progress in Ireland. It's not about the cost of living crisis, it's not about specific points in time, it's about kind of a high level, medium term view. You'll see the little dots on the top, those are our sustainability indicators. So again, they tend to be quite good, except again for the environment, climate and biodiversity. And also mental and physical health has just recently actually turned to a more neutral white. That's because the 2020 healthy life years came out, and that actually reduced. I'm guessing due to the impact of the pandemic, but again, it's kind of an interesting thing to see that change, because before it was very positive picture. We also, as I said, look at groups that experience a high proportion of disadvantage across different indicators, and just to call those out, it's not particularly surprising, but it is quite interesting to see it across all of these different areas. So those are women, single-parent households, households with lower incomes, people with a permanent sickness or disability, immigrants or non-Irish people, and households in rented accommodation. There's a lot more detail in our published report, which you can find on our wellbeing portal, but I'll leave it there in terms of what we found. So the other thing we did this year is, as part of the budgetary process, we kind of featured the wellbeing framework and the analysis as appropriate at these key points where budgetary discussions take place. So the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform chaired a breakout session at the National Economic Dialogue on the framework. The analysis was featured in the Summary Economic Statement. It featured in the expenditure reports, and it'll be doing so more so in the future. And there was also a new Budget Day document published by the Department of Finance, which explicitly looked at quality of life issues, and the analysis featured in that as well. I mean, the idea for this is that we want to broaden the context of those decisions, and we want to have discussions that aren't just purely about economics. And I mean, that trend has been happening already, but this is just a way to kind of bring some of those other aspects together under one roof. So the next steps, because obviously that's probably not enough, the next steps is Department of Public Expenditure is developing two kind of approaches to further integrate this into policy making. First of all, they're providing a tool, they're developing a tool to conduct policy reviews using the framework, and we're going to be trying to really get departments to use that as part of their spending review next year. They're also working on their expenditure policy. In particular, they're developing an approach to present current and capital expenditure using those dimensions. So again, it'll be a way of seeing how much money overall is being spent in these particular areas, and I think that'll be a really interesting thing to see once it's developed. We're also encouraging departments to develop their own subsets of indicators. We only have 35. It's not enough. It's not enough to kind of really show the detail that actual policymakers need to have, but we're trying to get them to develop their own indicators that link to ours, but have a bit more detail that they can then use. And we're hoping as well that that might be one of the avenues, we're exploring a few, but one of the avenues to start identifying those kind of co-benefit outcomes, to find areas where two departments or two sectors are trying to get to the same area, and can we get them to share resources, share benefits, and share and cooperate to get to that outcome. Finally, there's a lot of other countries that have done something like this. We are actively engaging with some of those countries to try to get as much learning as we can from them, and that will continue as well. So just to conclude, we've come a long way. We've gotten a lot done in 2 years, but at the same time, we're now at that implementation phase, which takes time. But we have a framework. We've started integrating it into the budget, and I think those are two huge steps that we've taken. We're actively right now exploring uses in the Irish context, and as we discuss with other countries, I'm really finding that the kind of legal, political, institutional context is very different in every country. So unfortunately, we can't just take their solution wholesale and do what they did. We have to kind of explore, and that's another reason why this implementation part will take time, because we want to make sure that it works and that we're not just implementing something that might not make that benefit that we want. Finally, this is a kind of a new initiative. It's a new way of working. It's a new way of thinking about things in this country. So we're really interested to hear from people, hear what you think about it, to hear if you think if there's a use for yourselves, or what you think if there's something missing, anything like that. We're really happy to hear from you guys. So obviously, I've already plugged the Wellbeing Portal, but there it is again. And I'm very happy to answer questions either today or later on. My email is there as well. So really do get in touch if you have any questions or want to talk about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lena. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions on the poll. We're going to have a poll question now, so we might show that if we can. So what environmental related action do you see as most needed for implementation to protect our health and well-being? And there are a selection of choices there that you can make on the slide, so people might turn their attention to that. And also to brew up some good questions, tricky questions maybe for our speakers for the panel discussion at the end. So I suppose now I should welcome home Ian Marnane. I don't know why I'm saying that as a London-Irish immigrant to these shores, but I feel like I should, because Ian's returned from Copenhagen, where he's worked with the European Environment Agency. Ian is a graduate at Trinity College Dublin. He's no stranger to most of you. He completed his PhD on air quality monitoring and modelling. He worked as a consultant for 7 years, and then he joined the EPA, working in different areas, including permitting, enforcement, and assessment. And now, as I said, he's with the European Environment Agency, and he's part of the Health and Sustainable Resource team. His particular area of work is the European Zero Pollution Action Plan, and looking at the progress reducing impacts of pollution on health and well-being. And he's going to speak, I think, on that theme now. So, Ian, you're very, very welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Maurice. Okay, thanks very much. My name is Ian Marnane, and I work for the European Environment Agency in Copenhagen, and it's lovely to be here this afternoon. So what I was asked to talk about today was some of the products and activities that we are carrying out in the EEA in relation to this area of environment and health. And when I started pulling together the presentation, I realized, Jesus, there's so much to talk about here. So I've got lots of information. I'm going to zip through it fairly quickly, but I hope it is useful in terms of giving you an idea of the kind of work that we're doing. So we have a really great team of people working in Copenhagen on this topic of environment and health, and we're developing a lot of exciting products. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about that today. So What I want to talk to you about first is the current products and activities. I'll talk about this briefly because we have some really exciting stuff coming up in the future that I want to spend a bit more time on. But our bread and butter products is what we call our EEA indicators, and these are all on our websites. And the idea of these indicators is that it's something that we update on an annual basis, and they give trends in relation to different metrics, for example, on air pollution, on the use of pesticides, on the use of hazardous substances, or the presence of hazardous substances in marine organisms, for example. So then we use this as a building block for a lot of our other reports and assessments as well. So I'm not going to go into detail on these, but these are all on our website. They're updated every year, and that's part of the the bread and butter stuff. And what I want to do is also talk about a few more specific recent products that we've been working on. And one is this briefing that we've produced on the linkages between environmental pollution and cancer. So we have about 2.7 million diagnoses of cancer in Europe every year. And as part of this briefing, we've identified that in or around 10% of these cancer cases are likely to be related to environmental pollution. And that's quite significant when you think that only around 40% of the risk factors influencing cancer are actually modifiable, if I can use that word. So, for example, you obviously can't change your family history, but exposure to pollution is one of the things that we can change, and an important mechanism through which we can reduce cancer related to cancer cases in Europe within all countries. So this is something that we explore a little bit in this assessment using data that we gathered through from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. So again, it's a useful web report to look at from that perspective. Another product that we have on our website is this City Viewer. And the idea of this City Viewer is that it looks at the last 2 years of data. At the moment, it's related to particulate matter, and then it ranks European cities according to the air pollution data over those last 2 years. So we're hoping to update it to bring in NO2 data as well. And then so all of those several hundred European cities are ranked. Just to give you an idea, Dublin is ranked 35, Cork is 38. Where else do we have? Limerick is 73rd, and Waterford is 130th. So there are some of the Irish cities that are included in this. The other thing that we've developed more recently is this air quality app, where people can log in real time to understand the air quality where they are at the moment. So this is something we've launched relatively recently, but we also want to improve this. In particular, we want to bring in some aspects of machine learning to be able to interpolate the air quality data between monitoring stations, so we can give a more precise indication of the air quality within those kind of areas. And we also want to bring in something around helping people to track their exposure. So as they move around during the day to different locations, different areas, to get an idea of their overall exposure and burden in relation to exposure to particulate matter. So that's something that we're hoping to develop on an ongoing basis. Another topic that we're spending a lot of time on is this idea of chemicals. And we have this briefing on this concept of moving towards safe and sustainable by design in relation to chemicals. Because chemicals obviously have quite a significant direct impact, but there's also a lot of indirect impacts in relation to, for example, impacting soil quality, which then impacts on food security. So it's important. It also supports the circular economy, for example, in terms of having safer materials that are easier to recycle. So it's a very important topic, and one that we're spending a lot of time on at the moment. And one of the issues we have is that the quantities of chemicals that we use are increasing on an ongoing basis. And the quantities of hazardous chemicals in particular have not decreased over time. So as part of this briefing, we look at how we can create an environment to enable this move towards more safe and sustainable by design chemicals. Another issue that's probably undervalued or underestimated is the impact of noise. And we have about 18 million people in Europe that are chronically disturbed or chronically annoyed as a result of transport noise. And we have a target to reduce that number by 50% by 2030. So we recently carried out a modelling assessment looking at the potential future scenarios, policy initiatives, and how this might be reduced. And unfortunately, the prospects aren't good. It seems that by 2030, with the most ambitious measures, we could probably reduce this by around 19%. Under a worst case scenario where we don't take these actions, it could actually increase by 3%. So again, it's a very undervalued impact, but I'll get back to this a little bit later as well in terms of other impacts of noise that we're not taking account of at the moment. This is also a particular issue for urban dwellers, so it's important, and we'll come back to the urban dwellers as well. This is a report that we released today. So I hope you're still with me. I know I'm going through a lot here. But this is a report that we released today on climate change impacts on health. And in particular, it looks at the impacts of temperatures. High temperatures. They've been discussed already today. So this is something we're well aware of. But we also explore this emerging threat of the increase in infectious diseases. And the graph you see on the screen there shows that in all areas of Europe, so including Ireland, the suitability of the environment for transmission of these infectious diseases is increasing year on year. And we've already seen, for example, an increase of 600% in cases of dengue fever since 1990. So again, there's a lot of information in this report, but also importantly, looking at the solutions and highlighting that we really need to take measures in relation to mitigation, but also importantly from an adaptation point of view, and that we need to have planning to deal with these issues. And again, urban dwellers are most impacted by these heat issues, and also in particular the elderly population. So now I'm going to go on to talk about some of the exciting stuff that we have in the pipeline. And watching this clock is terrifying. So the first thing I want to talk about is what I'm working on myself in particular is the Zero Pollution Action Plan, the EU Zero Pollution Action Plan. And the whole idea of this action plan is that by 2050, we reduce pollution to levels where there's no impact on humans and the environment. So that's the goal for 2050. But we also have some interim targets for 2030 that you can see on the screen there as well. And the role that we have in the EEA is to carry out the first zero pollution monitoring assessment. And this is going to be published on the 1st of December, so in a few weeks. So things are pretty busy at the moment. So this really sets the baseline in terms of how are we doing in moving towards these 2030 targets and also towards the longer term 2050 targets. So we look at all aspects in relation to air, noise, water, chemicals, soil. And at the moment, it looks like we're in, for example, just picking out a couple of these, we're in a good place to move towards meeting the target to reduce the health impacts of air pollution by 55%. As I've already said, noise is going to be a bit more of an issue, and other targets that you can see there on reducing nutrient losses, reducing plastic litter are going to be very challenging indeed. I just wanted to pick out a few specific points and issues that we highlight in the monitoring assessment. So the graph here essentially shows the difference in exposure between the richest and poorest people in Europe. So this is between 2007 and 2019. And you can see that there's a consistent and quite a significant gap in terms of the exposure of the richest and poorest. So for example, in 2019, it's nearly 50% higher in terms of those most disadvantaged people. So again, we're not really making a lot of progress in terms of this just transition that the European Commission are talking about, and that is a key aspect of this Zero Pollution Action Plan. We can also see the same in this graph, which shows the premature deaths for different age groups. And in this case, I've just picked out two pollutants. One is lead. People think that the problems with lead have gone away, but actually it's still very significant in terms of the impact on health and well-being. And again, you can see here, in particular for particulates, the very young and the older generation are most impacted, and for lead in particular exposure, it's the older generation. So again, showing that inequity across the age profile. There's another few emerging issues that we highlight in the assessment as well, and this is one that I want to spend a little bit of time on, but we try and showcase the findings from the HBM for EU projects. That's a human biomonitoring project that's been going on over the last few years, and it's trying to really get to the bottom of what are the impacts of chemicals on health, because we measure chemicals in the environment, in the water, in the air, in food, but really this gets to the crux of it by measuring the levels of chemicals in people. And here you can see for several of the countries that took part in the assessment, this shows the percentage of the candidates where the levels of this chemical bisphenol S were above the safe value. So for me, it really shows the power of this concept of human biomonitoring, that this gets straight to the question, how are we being impacted by these chemicals? And it's interesting because bisphenol S is a substitute for BPA. You might see on your bottles it says BPA free, but what you might not know is that actually bisphenol S maybe is the substitute that was used instead. And unfortunately, it's one of these cases of what's called regrettable substitution, where the chemical that's substituted ends up being found to be just as hazardous as the previous one. So this, we have data in the assessment for several other chemicals as well that show the exceedance of these human health guideline values for different pollutants. So again, it's really powerful information that we're highlighting there. Another issue that's emerging and which isn't currently regulated is this issue of light pollution. On the map here, so what we did as part of the assessment is we used satellite data, we analyzed satellite data and looked at the change in light pollution between 2014 and 2021. And here we have this concept of truly dark spaces based on a certain threshold, and we can see that actually the areas of truly dark spaces have decreased about 5% between those two time periods. And this has an impact on both human health, but also very importantly on biodiversity and ecosystems as well. From a human health perspective, urban dwellers again are the most impacted. And one of the issues we're seeing as well is that LED lighting is actually exacerbating this problem. So it's saving energy, but because of the wavelength of light for LEDs, it's actually having it's identified as having a bigger impact on biodiversity and on creatures that operate and are out at nighttime in particular. Finally, on this, one of the issues we pick out again is noise. When we have about 48,000 new cases of heart disease every year that are linked to noise, excessive noise exposure. But that's the key outcome, the health outcome that we're looking at. But there's a lot of new evidence that you can see on the screen here, which shows that there's lots of other health impacts related to noise that we're not currently quantifying. So for example, anxiety, dementia, cancers, obesity, etc. So it's likely, in fact, that we're quite significantly underestimating the impact of noise, and this is something that obviously needs to be looked at in the coming years. Okay, so I hope you're still with me. The next product this is a product, and just to say the zero pollution, as I mentioned, the zero pollution monitoring assessment will be published on the 1st of December. Something that we're going to deliver next year is this European Environment and Health Atlas. And the idea is that this is a sort of a one-stop shop to show all of the data that we have in EEA linking environment and health. It's quite a public focus, so it's quite simple language, simple messages. It has as much local data as we can provide as well. So just to give you a few ideas of some of the information that we have in here. So here's one of the maps which looks at the natural areas that are present in urban areas throughout Europe. So green is good, red is bad, and you can see in this case some of our northern European countries are particularly seem to be better served in terms of having that access to natural areas in these urban spaces. And we've already heard this morning about the benefits of these natural spaces for our health and well-being. Here, it's a pretty stark picture, but this shows the increase in heat wave days across Europe over the coming between 2031 and 2060. So this is startling, I guess, in terms of that even in countries like Ireland, we're probably seeing around 400 to 500% increase in the number of heat wave days over the summer. And as we've already said, this has a significant impact on health. But it also has indirect impacts in that, for example, it can affect food production. It may, for example, increase demand for things like pesticides because of increasing quantities of pests that we're trying to address or that we're trying to deal with in the agricultural scenario. So there's lots of aspects of this that are quite alarming from both an environmental and a health perspective. And again, we highlight that urban dwellers and the elderly, again, are particularly badly affected as a result of these measures. We will have this check your place function, which you can put your address into, and it highlights particular health-related metrics for your area. So I picked an area in the north side of Dublin here in Baldoyle, and it shows the different aspects, a number of different aspects, and you can see, for example, there's a slightly saddish face there in relation to the nearest green space to this, because it's around 1 kilometre away. So again, it addresses more direct factors like air quality, but also some of these other aspects in relation to accessibility to green space, for example, and noise as well. We can also compare between countries, and the graph is probably a bit difficult to see, but I've increased it here a little bit. And this is a measure of the dailies per 100,000 population. So this disability adjusted life years, which is a measure of both premature death, but also the impact of living with disabilities. So these are all directly comparable between countries. You can see Ireland is doing pretty well, actually. We're fourth on the list, so we're the fourth lowest country, so it's very good from that perspective. But what you can do also with this data is drill down into it and look at different environmental risk factors. So for example, what percentage of these dailies are related to exposure to radon, or exposure to lead, or exposure to particulate matter? So all of that will be available as part of this functionality. Okay, so, right, I'm nearly finished. But a few final things that I just wanted to tell you about. There's lots of exciting work going on. Unfortunately, I don't have time to tell you about everything, but there's a few particular ones that I wanted to highlight. So we've already talked a little bit this morning about the impacts of pollution on children, and this is something that we're going to focus on in a briefing we're producing next year, to look at some of these questions. Why are they more vulnerable? What is actually the impact? What diseases are we most concerned about? And importantly, to look at what are the solutions. How can we protect our young children? Because we know that exposure to chemicals like PFAS, for example, or to heavy metals like lead or mercury can have lifelong impacts on learning and development. So how can we protect children in those most vulnerable years? So that's something that we'll be looking at as part of this assessment. Another European initiative is this chemical strategy for sustainability. And this is, again, looking at this issue of how can we reduce our dependence on these most hazardous chemicals? How can we move towards this idea of safe and sustainable by design? Because we're not going to be able to get rid of chemicals, but how, in this particular case, can we maximize benefit to society and reduce impact? And this is this idea of moving towards safe and sustainable chemicals, of using generic risk assessments, for example, to regulate chemicals more effectively as groups, rather than regulating them individually and discovering too late that they're presenting particular health effects. So again, what we're doing in this is we're going to develop a dashboard which measures our progress towards reducing the impact of chemicals on our health and well-being. I already talked about that human biomonitoring data. And one of the things that we want to tease out from this, using this human biomonitoring data and using environmental data on pollutants, is what is the burden of disease related to chemical exposure? So we're going to start off with a small number of chemicals here. You can see them listed on the screen, and develop some EU-specific data on the chemical exposure or on the burden of disease, the impacts of premature deaths related to these chemicals. And I think this is going to be fairly significant, what we see here. And we're going to try and, again, build this up over time so that we increase our understanding of the real impact that chemicals are having on our health and well-being. And also to highlight, again, the value that human biomonitoring has as a tool. 43 seconds left. Another thing that we want to do, and actually this is the final thing, next year the Commission are proposing to publish a regulation on the sustainable use of pesticides. So what we want to do over the coming months, and what we propose to publish in February, is an assessment of the impacts of pesticides, the impacts on people from the data that we know, because we want to try and influence this regulatory process to make sure that the ambition level in this new EU regulation is as big as possible. So the plan is that we would launch this in Brussels and again try and engage in that process and make sure that the information is available and ready for the decision makers in terms of understanding the impacts that pesticides have, because there are competing messages here about the need for pesticides and the need for food security, and linking to issues around the war in Ukraine, etc. So this is an important job that we have as well in trying to make sure that the right people have the right information. So I'm finished. That was quite tiring for me, and probably for you as well. But I hope that it gave you a flavour of what we do and what we're doing. You know, we're really excited to be able to deliver some of this, and we do engage with countries a lot through our IONET network, and we're hoping that we'll get some feedback from countries as we develop these products. So thanks for your time today.
Ian, I'm sure everybody will join me and say that was fascinating, encouraging and exciting to watch. And can I come back with you to the European Environment Agency? So our final speaker, Anne Nolan, is going to join us remotely. So we might switch to Anne shortly, but I'll just give you a brief introduction to Anne. Anne Nolan is known to many of you, I'm sure. She's an associate research professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin, the partner organisation for this brilliant conference. She's an adjunct professor in economics at Trinity College Dublin. She's also a research affiliate at the Irish Longitudinal Study on Ageing, TILDA, at TCD, and on the study team management group of the Growing Up in Ireland study. Her main research interests are health economics, with a particular focus on social determinants of health, population ageing, and healthcare financing. And I think that's very much the area she's going to bring us through now in the next presentation. So,
okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much to the organisers for the invitation to speak to you today about health inequalities in a changing environment. And this is joint work with colleagues at the SRI, Sean Lyons and Greta Maughan. So what I'm going to sort of give you a bit of background to start off on is around the whole issue of health inequality. So we know that differences in health across the population are pervasive. So no matter which way you slice the population, by socioeconomic position, things like ethnicity, health is not distributed equally across those characteristics. And in Ireland, for example, life expectancy at birth varies by up to 5 years between those living in the most and the least deprived areas. So you can see that illustrated in the chart on the right here. So if you take the figures for males, for example, you see that those living in the least deprived 20% of areas across the country, the dark blue line, their life expectancy at birth is just over 84 years. For men that are living in the most deprived 20% of areas, that's 5 years less. It's just over 79 years. The similar gradient, slightly less for women. It's about 4.5 years difference between those living in the most and those living in the least deprived areas. But it's not just life expectancy, and it's not just across deprivation that you see these inequalities. You see broadly similar patterns for other countries, for other health outcomes, and using different indicators of socioeconomic position. So things like education, social class, income, and wealth. And I'm going to illustrate that here with data from Eurostat for a couple of different indicators of health, using different indicators of socioeconomic position, just to illustrate that these inequalities really are pervasive and exist regardless of the measure of socioeconomic position or the health outcome that's observed. Obviously, the sort of magnitude of the differences can differ, but you still see this pervasive inequality in health outcomes. So the chart on the left here is the proportion of the population age 15 plus who report depressive symptoms in 2019. You can see for both the EU 27 countries and for Ireland, there's that gradient across education levels here. So the darker blue line is those that have lower secondary education, that's their highest level. And the grey line then on the right is those that have a third level education. And you can see For the EU 27, for example, it's about twice as high in people who have lower levels of education. And you see a similar gradient then with a different indicator of health status. This is the proportion of the population reporting a sort of a chronic, long-standing illness. And this time with a different indicator of socioeconomic position, which is household income. And again, you see that social gradient in that health outcome. So why do these inequalities exist? So there's been quite a lot of work done by organizations such as the WHO, the European Commission, to sort of explain why we see these inequalities and what we can do in terms of policies to try and mitigate them. And broadly, it's the conditions in which people are born, grow up, work, live, and age, and sort of more broadly, people's access to power, money, and resources that are the major drivers of health inequalities. And you can see that here in the diagram on the right. So, you know, at the sort of red sort of center level, we have things that really are outside of our control, our age, sex, and our kind of genetic factors. But then there's a whole other set of layers of influences on our health that are generally modifiable. So things like our health behaviors, you know, smoking, diet, physical activity, but then more broadly, the sort of broader conditions, the social conditions in which we live. So things like our housing conditions, our working conditions, and the broader environment in which we live. And that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk. And just a couple more sort of observations on health inequalities. It's observed that you see this gradient in health outcomes from the least advantaged to the most advantaged. It's not just simply a difference between those at the top and the bottom. You will have seen that in the charts that I presented earlier. It's also true that the determinants operate at all stages of the life course. So if you look at health outcomes, for example, in very early life, things like infant mortality, right up to, you know, things that would be more pervasive in older age or health conditions in older age, you see these inequalities operating at all stages of the life course. And this means really that these inequalities, they require action on multiple policy fronts. So it's not just simply about access to healthcare. We see these inequalities in countries that have universal healthcare. So it's not just health policies, it's things to do with, for example, welfare and income support, housing conditions, and environmental conditions. And in Ireland, this is well recognised in policy. So Healthy Ireland, which is the strategic framework for health and well-being in Ireland, one of its 4 key goals is to reduce health inequalities. And the outcomes framework of Healthy Ireland sets out a key set of indicators to monitor progress. And I suppose most importantly for what we're talking about today, they note that the indicators will be disaggregated where possible in terms of things like age, gender, socioeconomic status, and geography, to allow sort of monitoring of progress and also comparison with national and international data. So it's not just enough to sort of present these indicators, but it's also important to drill down in how they are distributed across different sectors of the population. Similarly, there's a commitment to health inequalities and Sláinte Care, the sort of healthcare reform programme. And then, as we have heard from Lena at the Department of the Taoiseach in the context of the Wellbeing Framework for Ireland, sets out these set of indicators that sort of monitor broader indicators of quality of life. There's an increasing focus on the equality dimension there as well. And as she noted, there's poor performance on the environment, climate, and biodiversity theme at present. So focusing a little bit more on the environment and health inequalities, the European Environment Agency in 2018 noted that despite improvements in environmental quality across Europe over time, inequalities in exposure to and the impact of environmental conditions across socioeconomic groups persist across Europe. And they've done some initial analysis of this, so looking at the sort of joint distribution of socioeconomic status and the distribution of environmental conditions across Europe to see whether those living, for example, in more disadvantaged areas have higher exposure to sort of things like air pollution, poor water quality, noise, and other environmental pollutants. And they've done some analysis at a very sort of aggregated regional level. So this is NUTS 2 level. across Europe of the association between various indicators of socioeconomic position and environmental exposures, things like air quality and noise. And you can see here the results of one of those analyses, which is looking at how PM 2.5 and PM 10, so these sort of key environmental exposures for air quality, are distributed across quintiles of the population that are disaggregated by levels of education. So you can see that there's broadly a gradient across areas that are defined by different levels of education. So starting on the left-hand side, areas that are most advantaged, they have higher shares of their population with higher levels of education. They have lower levels of PM 2.5 and 10 as areas that have much lower levels of education on the right-hand side. But I suppose the one of the key conclusions from the EEA analysis was that the association between socioeconomic position and air pollution, as one example, was found to be highly location and scale specific. And they did make a case for research at much more granular levels. As I mentioned, the analysis that I'm showing you here is based on NUTS2 regional aggregations, which are really large regional aggregations used by the European Commission. So that's where we're coming in this project. So what we're doing here is we're focusing on what the EEA call the spatial overlap of environmental hazards and social vulnerability. There's a much broader and a sort of a growing related discussion on how socioeconomic groups differ in the way in which environmental hazards impact on their health. So for a given level of an environmental hazard, those in different socioeconomic groups may be impacted differently because, for example, they live in different quality housing. But we're not going to deal with that today. So as part of our research program funded by the EPA, we're going to try and I suppose build on the analysis that was done in the EEA report by looking at much more granular regional levels in Ireland to look at how socioeconomic status and environmental conditions are sort of jointly distributed. So what I'm going to show you today is some very preliminary analysis that we have started as part of that program. So it's very descriptive, but I suppose you'll get a good flavor, I suppose, for what we're going to try and expand on in the broader project. So the environmental exposure that I'm going to talk about today is concentrations, annual concentrations of PM 2.5. And these are data from sort of spatial or rather satellite data. And we have data, annual data going back to 1998. So I'm going to take data for 2002 and 2016 because that corresponds with the census of population data, which is where we get our information on socioeconomic status. So socioeconomic position data comes from the 2016 census of population, and it comes from the small area population statistics. And what I've done here is we've chosen sort of three broad indicators of socioeconomic position. We're also looking at an indicator of ethnicity, but we still need to do a bit of work on that. So we're taking the proportion of a population without third level education, that are in semi or non-skilled social class, and that are in non-owner occupied housing. And we're looking at a spatial level at the distribution of these socioeconomic characteristics, allied then to the distribution of air pollution. And as I mentioned, it's matched at the level of the 2016 census small area. And these are sort of very small areas. There's over 18,000 across the country, which correspond to about 100 households. And they're sort of very relatively socially homogenous within those small areas. So first of all, it's instructive to ask what has happened to air quality over that period, 2002 to 2016. So this simply plots the average PM 2.5 level in each of the small areas, in each of those 18,000 small areas across the country for 2002 and 2016. So there's two things to note here. I suppose, first of all, there's a broad, improvement in air quality. So much darker levels of green in the first map relative to the map for 2016. But I suppose secondly, it's really difficult to sort of drill down into what's happening in small areas because there's so many of them. So in this chart then, what I'm showing you are just a snapshot for some of the Dublin small areas. So you can see again that sort of broad trend of improvement in air quality. And you can also see how air quality varies across different areas of the country. Not surprisingly, it's much higher in sort of city centre areas than it would be in more suburban or rural areas. So the next part of the project then obviously is to show how socioeconomic position varies across small areas. So again, we've done this for the whole country, but what I'm showing you here are just the snapshots for that sort of Dublin area, just because it's easier to see what's going on in this chart. So basically what I'm showing you here are the share of the population in each of the small areas that have less than a third level education. So basically darker colours represent more disadvantaged areas, and you can see, I suppose, consistent with what we know about the Dublin area, there's higher proportions of more lower levels of education in sort of north and west Dublin than there are in sort of south Dublin. Similar issue then when we look at the proportion of the population in each of the small areas that have a semi or unskilled social class. Again, darker green represents more disadvantaged areas. There's something a little bit odd, I think, going on with UCD there, that dark blob you see on the bottom of the chart. So we'll have to figure that out a little bit more, but possibly due to the way in which social class is assigned within households. And then secondly, or thirdly rather, we look at the distribution of non-owner occupied housing. A little bit more of a nuanced picture here, much higher levels of non-owner occupied housing in the city centre, as you would expect, but also sort of higher levels in some of the coastal areas in South Dublin, which we might not have expected. So I suppose this really highlights the importance of looking at different indicators of socioeconomic status and really drilling down into small areas. So then the final part of the project then that I'm showing you today is sort of putting all these pieces of information together. So we know how socioeconomic status is distributed across small areas. We know what the corresponding levels of PM 2.5 are. So is there a relationship between them? So do people in more disadvantaged areas, are they more exposed to higher levels of PM 2.5? And the answer really is pretty nuanced, and it depends on the indicator of socioeconomic status that we're looking at. So what I'm showing you here is average levels, annual levels of PM 2.5 on the y-axis, how they're distributed across small areas defined on the basis of the share of the population without a third level education. So moving from left to right on the X or horizontal axis, those at the left-hand side are the most advantaged 20% of small areas, and those on the right are the least advantaged 20% of small areas. And you can see that it's kind of a U-shaped relationship here. So it's not just the case that those in the least advantaged areas have higher levels of PM 2.5. It's also the case that those in the most advantaged small areas have higher levels of PM 2.5. And remember that these data that I'm showing you here, these are summarized for the whole country, so not just the Dublin area. We see a similar pattern, a kind of this U-shaped relationship when we look at social class. But when we look at non-owner occupied housing, we see something that's probably closer to what we would have expected to see earlier on, which is that those living in the least advantaged areas, so those that have the highest share of non-owner occupied housing, are exposed to higher levels of PM 2.5 than those in the more advantaged small areas. So in terms of preliminary conclusions and next steps, we know that the natural and built environment is an important component of the social determinants of health. And there is increasing research and policy focus on how inequalities and environmental exposures translate into health inequalities. So as I mentioned, it's a key policy objective of Healthy Ireland's launch a care and the wellbeing framework to reduce health inequalities. An analysis by the European Environment Agency at NUTS 2 and NUTS 3 level across Europe has shown some relationships between things like poor air quality and exposure to noise and socioeconomic factors across Europe. But there was a need highlighted in that report for much more granular spatial analysis. And that's what we're hoping to do through this research program at the ESRI. I've shown you some very preliminary results and really sort of set out the methodology that we're going to use for the project. So this preliminary analysis sense of small area points to inequalities, but further modelling is required. And we need to understand, for example, why we see different patterns using different indicators of socioeconomic status. We're also hoping to extend this to analyse other environmental exposures, things like NO2, access to blue and green space, for example, and also other indicators of socioeconomic position. So what I've shown you so far are sort of individual level or household level indicators of socioeconomic position, but we can also think about much more composite indicators, things like area level deprivation, which was one of the indicators that I showed in the very first chart, looking at how life expectancy varies across areas defined by their sort of overall or composite level of deprivation. And they might be able to sort of tell us different things about these relationships between socioeconomic position and environmental factors. So I'll leave it there, and there's a set of references on the slides and have further details on what's been presented.
So thank you, Anne, for an excellent presentation. And Anne's online to take any questions that come in. So before we go to the questions, I'm sure you're all waiting with bated breath to see the poll and see what the running order is. So maybe we could show that on the screen. So that's some of the questions, the Slido questions, but the poll, have we got the poll? Yeah, so greenhouse gases, so climate again, I think, is the top answer, with the other range of choices. So I suppose if we go to the question, what struck me though before we go to questions was that I think it's fantastic to see the way the European Environment Agency are using data and citizen science as a way of galvanizing interest around new topics and looking at exposure and risk and inequality all at the same time. It kind of links all the presentations together. And if anything's going to drive implementation, it's going to be continued interest and, I suppose, citizens taking ownership of it, watching this space, and everyone being involved and watching how the metrics change and improve over time. And I think also the use of data to target resources struck me as kind of a key component that came out, and it came out of comments I think Laura made this morning in the opening session. So, so I don't know if we've got any questions on Slido yet, Catherine or Andy. We might give those people a bit more as there's an inequality in the questions asked earlier.
There's inequalities in everything,
yeah.
Morris, as I think we know. So I'll try and pull some of these together. Just interesting to see that Helen Maher, an ex-EPA colleague, I think is working in HSC. So people doing from EPA to HSC as time has gone by. Just highlighting the infrastructure decarbonisation roadmap that HSC published and just giving a link to that. Just again, showing some of the climate actions that have been taken by HSC. I suppose just to start with Ian, there's two questions kind of related here, Ian. The first one is, what can we do about light pollution? You highlighted it as an issue, just give us some of the ideas of directions of actions that might be taken. And the second one for yourself is around air pollution, and Ronan, who asked the question, indicates that air pollution seems to be driving 50% of the burden of disease. I didn't quite capture that, but you're nodding, so it must have been there, and I just missed it in the slide. And as a key driver of climate collapse, doesn't that make it the key priority? So it's the question of, how much effort do we put into dealing with the individual kind of issue? If you like, I can stop there, Morris, and I come back with more questions.
Give Ian a chance to take breath.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Just on the light pollution question, what can we do about light pollution? Well, first of all, there's no regulatory, in most countries, there's no regulatory process for addressing the issues caused by light pollution. But there are certain countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, where they're pushing the agenda And I think this is something that will come up in the next Commission. We have a new European Commission that will come into place next year, I think. And I think this is going to be more of a topic that will be pushed there. But one of the things, for example, that happens in these countries is that they designate areas to protect them in terms of making sure that they maintain, where they're dark already, that they maintain those sort of truly dark spaces at nighttime. So I think that's one thing we can do. We can also, I suppose, regulate. I think one of the things that will happen as well is because of the cost of electricity, there's going to be less lighting at nighttime. So maybe there's a sort of a perverse impact of the economic impact of the cost of electricity. But I think the regulatory process is really what we need to have an EU-wide process that addresses the risks of light pollution, and also to understand what we can do from a technology point of view, because LED lighting seems to make things worse. So what can we change from a technology perspective to make those LED bulbs better in terms of preventing those kind of issues? And maybe to stop these kind of lights that you see people now have outside their house that seem to point upwards and downwards at the same time. So these kind of things are important. But I think the first thing is a regulatory framework. On the second point around, I mean, that is the case, that 50% of the burden of disease is related to air pollution. One of the things I would say about that is we know that because of how much work we've done in relation to air pollution. I think it's clear that we significantly underestimate the burden of disease related to other issues like, for example, chemicals in particular. We're making a lot of good progress in relation to reducing the impact of air pollution. So we need to continue that, but we also need to focus on some of these other areas as well, where we don't know the burden. And we probably underestimate, I've mentioned noise impact, I've mentioned chemicals. I think there are two important areas where we need to increase awareness. Chemicals is probably the area that has been least researched and significantly underestimated, I think.
Okay, so I might go to a question in the room if anyone wants, if you just like to wait for the mic and remind us who you are and pose your question.
Hello, Anna Rakovec, Irish Doctors for the Environment and a chemical pathologist in Tala. So I actually wanted to ask you the question about the endocrine disrupting chemicals. One thing that would really interest me is whom are you collaborating for the Human Biomarkers Project in Ireland, and how many samples have been collected from Ireland, from which areas, kind of a little bit more granularity about that. And then I know that in terms of the second part of the question, that there was a significant lobbying opposition to reducing plastics in healthcare when the European medical devices regulation was brought in, and that a lot of the Healthcare Without Harm's efforts to phase out bisphenol A and S and phthalates and the forever chemicals out of medical devices has been blocked at several levels. So I would welcome your opinion on that and an insight. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. It's a good question. As far as I know, maybe Maurice, you can correct me on this, but there was no there was no specific monitoring of people as part of the assessment of the HBM for EU project. So all of the countries that you see there were the main countries that took part. So I'm not aware of any specific Irish data on the levels of these chemicals in people at the moment. There is one of the things I would say is that, so this HBM for EU project is now finished, but there is a successor to this called PARC, which looks, again, will continue the work of HBM for EU and also bring in an element of risk assessment in relation to assessing the risk of chemicals in a more holistic way. And there is an opportunity for Ireland to take part in that PARC project. I think pretty much every EU country is engaging in the PARC project. So it's only kicking off now. It will be a 7-year project, and there's squillions of euro being spent on it. I don't know exactly, it's hugely impressive. But I think this is going to be the last step, I feel, before there is some regulatory process to actually make human biomonitoring maybe more part of our day-to-day monitoring that we do. So I think it's useful to have that discussion about how Ireland could engage in the PARC project. In relation to plastics, I think there will always be essential uses for some of these chemicals, but really the key is to identify when you do push manufacturers, they are very good at finding substitutes. So I think we do need to push the regulatory process and phase out some of these chemicals, because, you know, people said for years that, oh, we can't remove solvents from paints because paints, they won't work anymore. But then when push came to shove, suddenly, you know, we have all of these water-based paints that are probably better than solvent-based paints. So I think when the pressure comes on, the technology will happen. So I think that's something that we need to do, because we know the damage that these things like phthalates, bisphenols and PFAS cause. So we need to phase them out, particularly in young people and vulnerable groups. So I think it's very important from that perspective. But I think there are some discussions ongoing around Ireland's engagement in the park project. So
yeah, I might just come in on the HBM4U project because I was the national hub for it. So Ireland wasn't directly involved, but that doesn't mean that we weren't involved in some way, because they worked on a smart way that they used data sets that existed already for a number of chemicals, and then they conducted a number of aligned studies in 4 quadrants of Europe for things like PFAS, and that data is available on their website now. So it's a very exciting, innovative field. It's developing all the time. It's developed out of 2 other programs. It's grown every time. It's morphed into a different way of working, but it is the way to validate whether we are controlling chemicals and human exposure. And it's looking at risk thresholds and all this and epigenetics and all these exciting ways of reducing human exposure, mortality and morbidity, you know, into the future. So the NHANES model is something that Europe is looking at. It's mimicked in places like Korea and Canada, and that's what Europe is looking to move towards. So, and then it's linking now to this huge program called PARC. So, so there must be more questions in the room if someone would like to raise a hand. Over here, please.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm David Fenton from the EPA. Another question for Ian. I was thinking of Anne or Lena, but I'll go with Ian. In one of your first slides, Ian, was to do with EEA and the link between pollution and cancer. And just my question is supposed to do with the term cancer. The term cancer is an umbrella term for about 100 different diseases. Is there a particular type of cancer or disease that you're particularly worried about in relation to pollution, or flip that the other way, are the types of cancers that you're not particularly worried about when it comes to pollution? Thanks.
yeah, thanks, David. You know, first of all, you know, I must first confess that I'm an engineer. So, you know, we have to bear that in mind. But yeah, I mean, I think there obviously are certain types of cancer. I mean, somebody else might want to come in on this, but for obviously things like skin cancer, there are, well, this is where increase in heat wave days, for example, can impact the prevalence of these kind of cancers as well, and how we protect people. But I think in relation to these PFAS and endocrine disruptors, there are particular cancer groups that are more at risk. We haven't gone into that in detail in the assessment, because we wanted to keep it more generic, just really to highlight that environmental pollution is one of those modifiable risk factors that we can address. So I can't answer the specifics as to what types of cancers, but it is more focused on certain outcomes than others, yeah.
Have we any more questions in the room, or will we go back to slide over here?
Hi, good afternoon, is it, or morning still, I'm not sure, but thank you everybody for really interesting presentations. I have a question about the well-being framework. When you said you've looked at other countries, and I was particularly wondering whether you've looked at the Welsh model, which has legislated when their Wellbeing of Future Generation acts and has a commissioner for future generations. Because she visited here last week and she said that the Irish government had expressed some interest, which obviously they've achieved great things already. Yeah. And the UN have said they're ahead of the game and we need to be where they are. So.
A bit of a challenge for us, yeah. No, absolutely. We actually, myself and some colleagues met with her when she was visiting. She's very impressive, and it's a really interesting model. I think that one is one that the Welsh model is one of those ones where we're exploring it. We don't want to go too fast, and these different contexts become very important here. Our legislative process is quite slow, so we don't want to start legislating for something and get it caught up in this legislative process until we know that there's no other way of doing things before that. So we're kind of exploring other ways of accomplishing the same thing. And similarly, in terms of appointing an actual commissioner, we want to wait until the legislation sets out specific things that departments have to do before they make a decision, and we want to kind of get to that stage. You know, we're not there yet in terms of how are we actually using this, what are we actually trying to promote through this. So we're quite a few steps back behind the Welsh example, and I think our context is different as well. So I think we're learning a lot, and I really like their ways of working, and there's a lot of really interesting things that they're doing, and we're learning a lot, and we're in direct contact with them, so we're well aware of that example. Yeah, absolutely.
So we have another question over here, a couple of questions, but I might go to Slido. Have we something on Slido while the mic is moving? Oh, you have the mic.
I've got
this
the
will be
mic.
interesting.
I'll pass it over to you.
You have to move, Andy, as well as speak.
Just one here that may work for Lena or may also work for Anne, which is, you know, highlighted that, you know, the inequalities in health outcomes depending on a variety of factors. The question is, can you comment on the most important policy to address that inequality? So you have all of these, we've got all of these facets, elements, whatever ways you want to look at. What's the standout one for yourself that you might want to pull out of the mix and say, if we address that one, it might have a higher impact? It's the low-lying fruit question with respect to all of the policy interventions. So maybe Anne first, possibly, if I might suggest, Maurice, and I'll pass over to Alan.
Sure. Thanks very much, Andy. So, excuse me, I'm going to give the typical researcher's response about I really couldn't choose one, but I suppose I would go back to that overarching framework and that diagram that I showed you earlier. And I think one really important part of this actually is making sure that the policy process recognizes the interlinkages between these. So, you know, if you are the Department of Health, you know, you should also be thinking about your linkages with the Department of Housing. You should be thinking about your linkages with the Department of Social Protection. So, and I think, you know, Healthy Ireland has certainly, you know, when it was developed in 2013, it's nearly 10 years ago now, it did sort of set out that framework. But I suppose we need to make sure that that framework it's been implemented, it's been adhered to, and those linkages are being reflected in how policy is being implemented. I suppose the work that we're doing, you know, why we are looking at different dimensions of socioeconomic position is that can often lead you to sort of insights into the particular mechanisms that are of particular importance for different aspects of, you know, environmental risk or environmental hazards. So, for example, with respect to green space, you know, we might find that it's things to do with the distribution of housing that's really crucial here. Whereas for something like air pollution, it might be something to do with, you know, income and the quality of people's housing. So I think, you know, drilling down into those sort of indicators of socioeconomic status kind of often lead you down that pathway into recognizing what those mechanisms are and what the most appropriate policy responses might be.
Okay. Lena, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think Anna's kind of, it's almost exactly what we're trying to do here, and I think I'm glad that you mentioned Healthy Ireland as well, because Healthy Ireland is a really important piece of, like, we're kind of trying to broaden it out beyond that health aspect, but I think it was a really good model in terms of showing those interlinkages beyond a specific sector and broadening it out and showing how different aspects can impact on something that's so important as health. I also wanted to mention that health is seen as one of the most important factors for that subjective well-being indicator, which is kind of our high-level indicator, and I think that's a really important point to make. And then, so that interconnection between income, between where you live, between the number of people that you have, and then bringing that up to subjective well-being. So I think for me, trying to get departments to talk to each other, trying to make sure that that outcome focused is really implemented across government is a huge focus, and I think that hopefully will support that health and reducing health inequalities.
Anybody in here want to ask a question? Still, we have a minute left, so we can squeeze somebody in. So the front row here is the lady at the back. Okay.
I've had my paw up for a while, but anyway,
Okay.
I'm hard to
Sorry.
see down the back, Maurice.
I didn't see that one. Apologies.
Yvonne Malooly, Assistant Chief Executive with the Health and Safety Authority, and I have the responsibility for the chemicals brief within the authority, and I'm also a member of the EPA's Advisory Board. And just, I suppose, before I ask my question, I suppose just give a bit of context maybe to some of the questions that were asked to Ian in relation to the whole area of chemicals. There were some questions there about cancers and in particular areas and all the rest of it. But when it comes to chemicals, there's no one cancer as such that is particular that we're, that there is a focus on, because there can be many myriads of different cancers. There can be target organ cancers, or there can be widespread cancers. But they've been quite heavily regulated when it comes to the chemicals area, and they've been quite closely looked at for quite a number of years. But as Ian mentioned, what the future focus will be in terms of environmental health when it comes to chemicals will be very much in the space of endocrine disruptors and the impacts that they will have, and which also can obviously lead to cancers as well. So that will be the future focus when it comes to chemicals. Ian, you mentioned about bisphenol S, BPS, and I suppose the increase in production of bisphenol S resulted from the restriction from BPA, but at the time that the European Chemical Agency had developed its scientific opinion, it had highlighted, I suppose, BPS. But you'll be glad to know that there's a lot of work being done in that space by the European Chemical Agency, looking not just at BPS, but a whole myriad of chemicals that are very similar to that. So we don't have that regrettable substitution. So I'd expect to see a restriction proposal coming in relation to BPS plus many other chemicals that have similar kind of structures as well, and industry will be very aware of that. That's coming down the line. So hopefully we won't see those levels of BPS increasing any further. My question really is coming back to the whole area of human biomonitoring, and I know somebody asked a question about PARC and that, and my understanding is that Ireland hasn't signed up to the PARC project and is I think possibly maybe the only member state that hasn't, and maybe there might be one more that hasn't, but I do know that. But I suppose the challenge, and Maurice, you'll know this yourself as well, the challenge in relation to, I suppose, when you're undertaking human biomonitoring is that when you undertake the biomonitoring and you test for particular substances, and then you find that these levels are above, say, WHO standards or other limits, then the messaging around how you address that in the general population, or with those that want to know, well, what are the results of my biomonitoring? And I'm just wondering, how has that been addressed at a European level? I suppose because it is maybe a nervousness maybe within regulators or within policymakers as to how to address that particular issue. If you have any thoughts or insights on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I can comment briefly on that, but maybe I'll hand over to Maurice just to talk about that sort of ethical issue. But first, just in relation to the involvement of Ireland in the PARC project, I mean, it doesn't have to be specifically or starting in relation to carrying out biomonitoring. There's lots of different programs within the PARC project where Ireland can get involved. It's going on for 7 years, so that could develop over time in relation to the level of engagement there. But Maurice, you might want to talk more about this.
They've developed standard responses and briefings for people, but of course you don't know the underlying conditions or circumstances of individuals, and that's really down for medical doctors to give that precise advice. And it's obviously a very worrisome time for someone who gets an exceedance in any level. So it's a tricky area that people are naturally cautious of, and there are certain ethical issues around it, but there is a lot of supports and guidelines around it in Europe, and a lot of other member states have taken this on in quite a full fashion, particularly the Germans and the Belgians. So I'm going to have to wrap this up for us, folks, because we're running into lunchtime and I'll be shot. And so I want to thank everyone for attending so actively, and all the questions online and in the room. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody. I want to thank Anne for being so patient and listening there and answering her questions, and for Ian and Lena for being such excellent speakers, and for you for attending. And if you come back for 2 o'clock in the room and online at 2 o'clock, please. And for those in the room, we're in the Chalavar restaurant now for lunch. So thank you.